Welcome to Mr. Hutchings History, where the past comes alive. Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're diving into something kind of different.
Yeah,
Martin Luther King Jr.'s campaign in Chicago back in 1966.
right.
We usually think about Dr. King and, the South.
Of course.
But this move up north was a big shift for him and for the whole movement.
Yeah, it really challenges how we see Dr. King, not just as a Southern figure.
Right.
It shows us how the civil rights movement was changing,
Yeah,
moving beyond just laws and stuff.
exactly. And to really get into this, we're going to be looking at this podcast.
Okay.
It's called Mr. Hutchings History. Have you heard of it?
I have. Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, so we're looking at episode 63.
Okay.
Specifically, it's called Understanding Failure, Martin Luther King Jr. and the Chicago Campaign.
Interesting title.
Yeah, so we're going to unpack, why is this campaign seen as a failure and, what can we learn from it today,
Right, because by 66, the big civil rights laws they'd already passed,
Yeah,
but all the systemic problems, like you said, housing discrimination, poverty, no jobs, bad schools, those were still huge for Black Americans.
right.
So the SCLC with Dr. King, they saw Chicago as this.
Like a test case.
Yeah, exactly. Like a microcosm of all these problems.
So they were shifting from, legal rights to more
Social and economic justice.
yeah.
It's just a big leap, you
Yeah.
know? You can make segregation illegal, but that doesn't magically make everything equal.
Right, it doesn't make those opportunities just
And
appear.
No, it doesn't. And that's what the Chicago campaign was trying to do, tackle those deep inequalities.
Way more ambitious than anything they'd tried before, huh?
Way more complex.
And as we all know, it didn't really work out the way they planned.
Right. It's usually seen as a failure.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of reasons for that.
Okay, so break it down for us. What went wrong?
Well, one thing that's often forgotten is they just weren't prepared.
Really?
The SCLC, they were used to the South.
Right.
And they underestimated how tough the North would be.
Huh.
The podcast even mentions this crazy detail. The SCLC staff got to Chicago, and they didn't even have winter coats.
What?
Yeah.
That's wild. It's Chicago in the winter. You got to have a coat.
Exactly. It makes you wonder if they really understood what they were getting into.
Yeah, did they really grasp how different things would be?
Yeah.
It's like they showed up for a marathon in flip-flops.
Uh-huh. Yeah, kinda. I
Yeah.
think we've all had those moments where we've totally misjudged a situation.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
And for the SCLC, it shows maybe some naivete, maybe even some overconfidence from their wins in the South.
Yeah, it's like that saying, assumptions are the termites of relationships.
Uh-huh.
But in this case, their assumptions about Chicago might have doomed them from the start.
It's possible.
But, it wasn't just the coats, right?
Right.
What else was going on?
Oh, yeah, there were other things going on at the same time. The Meredith March in Mississippi was happening.
Right.
And that pulled a lot of attention and resources away from Chicago.
Yeah, that makes sense. You
Mm.
can't be everywhere at once.
No, you can't. And running a movement takes a lot of organization. People, time, money.
Mm.
And having to manage all these things at the same time was a huge burden on the SCLC.
It's like when you have a million deadlines at work.
Yeah.
And you're just pulled in every direction.
Exactly. And in this case, the stakes were way higher.
Yeah, no kidding.
But it wasn't just logistics. They also had trouble mobilizing Chicago's Black population.
Right. Chicago's huge.
It is. And it's really diverse. And the podcast brings up Ella Baker and her critiques of the SCLC's approach.
Okay, so for those who don't know, Ella Baker was a big deal in the movement.
Yeah, she was amazing.
She was all about grassroots organizing and giving power to the community.
Absolutely.
So what was it about the SCLC's approach that she didn't like?
Well, Baker believed that real change couldn't come from the top down. She felt that the SCLC, with these national leaders coming in to lead the charge,
Yeah.
it didn't have enough local involvement.
So she wanted people in Chicago to lead their own liberation.
Exactly. She wanted to empower the community to make the change themselves.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if the SCLC really understood the dynamics in Chicago.
It's a good question.
This whole thing about national leadership versus what communities need is something we still see today.
All the time. It's in politics, in activism, even in businesses.
Yeah.
There's often this gap between the people making the decisions and the people those decisions affect.
And the Chicago campaign shows just how important it is to close that gap.
For sure. But let's not forget about the opposition they faced.
Right. You mean like the white segregationists and stuff.
Well, them too. But the podcast reveals that there was also resistance from within the Black community itself.
Whoa, really?
Yeah, like groups like the NAACP disagreed with the SCLC's strategies.
Mm.
And some black churches were hesitant to support the campaign.
Wow, I never would have thought.
It wasn't a united front. They had their own priorities and ways of doing things.
So even with the shared goal of equality, there were different ideas about the best way to get there.
Exactly.
It just goes to show you these movements are never as simple as they seem.
Definitely. And then there's Mayor Richard Daley.
Oh yeah, powerful guy.
He wasn't exactly a fan of the civil rights movement,
Right.
but he was a smart politician.
Okay.
And instead of using the police to stop the marches, which is what he did in the South, he did something totally unexpected.
Now I'm really curious. What did he do?
He told the police to protect the marchers.
What?
Yeah, he knew that if the police were brutal to peaceful protesters,
Right.
that would just make people support the movement more.
Like what happened in the South?
Exactly. So by protecting the marchers, he kind of took away one of the SCLC's biggest weapons.
That's crazy. It's like he outsmarted them.
He did, and instead of filling up the jails with protesters...
Which would have looked really bad for him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Daley used a different tactic, fines. Fines.
Fine.
Every arrest, every demonstration meant fines for the SCLC.
And that drained their resources.
Yep. It was a pretty clever strategy.
More like sneaky, if you ask me.
Haha. Yeah, maybe a little bit. But it worked.
It's like he knew that sometimes the best way to win a fight
Yeah.
isn't by being the strongest, but by being the smartest.
Absolutely. And it's something we still see today.
Yeah, like how?
Well, governments and big companies, they use all sorts of tricks to stop movements that threaten them.
Oh yeah, like what kind of tricks?
Legal challenges, bureaucracy, PR campaigns to make activists look bad.
It's like a whole different kind of battle.
Exactly. It's not always out in the open.
So it's better to just quietly shut a movement down?
Than to make martyrs out of them.
Right.
And on top of all that, the federal government was starting to pull back their support too.
You mean President Johnson?
Yeah, he'd been a big ally of the civil rights movement.
But now he wasn't so sure about Dr. King.
Right. The podcast says it was partly because King was speaking out against the Vietnam War.
Oh yeah, that was a big deal back then.
It was, and Johnson felt betrayed by it.
So that created a rift between them.
It did, and this is important because it shows how connected all these political issues are.
Yeah.
Taking a stand on one thing can have unexpected consequences on something else.
So get a chain reaction.
King's opposition to the war was a matter of principle,
Of course.
but it might have cost him crucial support for the Chicago campaign.
Wow, so it's like these movements, they're not happening in isolation.
No, they're not. They're influenced by all these political and social forces.
So you've got all these challenges happening at the same time.
Right. Lack of preparation, competing priorities.
Local opposition.
A clever mayor, dwindling federal support. It's no surprise the campaign had a tough time.
It's like everything that could go wrong did go wrong.
Pretty much. But even though the Chicago campaign is often seen as a failure,
Right.
it still had a big impact. It wasn't all for nothing.
Okay, so tell me about that. What was the impact?
Well, the podcast talks about how some historians see it as the start of local initiatives like Operation Breadbasket.
What was that?
It focused on economic empowerment for Black communities,
All right.
and it had some real wins.
So even though the campaign didn't hit its original goals, it created something new.
Exactly, something that worked at the local level.
So there was positive change that came out of it.
There was, and politically, Chicago showed how nonviolent direct action might not work so well in the North.
Like the strategies they used in the South.
Right, they didn't translate as well to problems like poverty and housing.
So the movement had to adapt.
It did. It had to evolve, and the Chicago campaign was a big part of that.
And for Dr. King personally.
Yeah, it was a real turning point for him.
He realized that just changing laws wasn't enough.
Right. He saw that real racial equality meant confronting the whole economic system.
Wow. So he was starting to think about things in a more radical way.
He was, and this experience laid the groundwork for his Poor People's Campaign.
The one that focused on economic justice for everyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So Chicago was a setback for sure, but it pushed King towards a bigger vision of justice.
One that connected race and poverty.
Exactly. But it also led to something else that was more immediate and maybe even more radical. The rise of the Black Power movement.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've heard about that.
The podcast talks about how a lot of younger activists saw the Chicago campaign as a failure.
They thought it proved that the SCLC's way was too slow.
Yeah, and that they were too willing to compromise with the white power structure.
So they wanted something different.
They did. They wanted Black self-determination.
What does that mean?
It means Black people controlling their own communities and their own destinies.
Okay, so not just integration.
Right. They wanted to build their own power separate from white society.
So while Dr. King was broadening his focus to include economic justice,
Right.
other activists were moving towards a more revolutionary approach.
Exactly. And the perceived failure of the Chicago campaign really fueled that movement.
It's like it showed a split in the movement
Yeah, a generational divide.
between working within the system and wanting to completely change it.
And we can't forget about the people in Chicago.
Right? The Black community that had put so much faith in Dr. King.
The podcast talks about how disillusioned they felt when the campaign didn't succeed.
It's heartbreaking they risked everything to support this movement.
They did their livelihoods, their safety, their reputations.
And when it didn't work out the way they hoped, it must have been devastating.
It's a powerful reminder that these historical events, they're not just abstract ideas.
Yeah, they have a real impact on people's lives.
Exactly, on their hopes and dreams.
It makes you think about how we deal with setbacks in our own lives.
Yeah.
We might not be leading huge movements, but we all face challenges, things that don't go as planned.
That's true.
How do we deal with those expectations? How do we keep going when things get tough?
Those are big questions. It's easy to get caught up in wanting quick results, instant gratification.
Yeah.
But real change, especially deep systemic change, takes time.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Exactly. It takes patience, persistence, and a willingness to learn from your mistakes.
And I think that's one of the biggest lessons from the Chicago campaign.
Yeah.
It wasn't a victory, but it was a learning experience.
It was a turning point. It forced Dr. King and the movement to adapt and grow.
And to expand their idea of what justice means.
Exactly.
It's easy to say that, but actually living it.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's tough. But that's what's so amazing about Dr. King.
Absolutely.
Even when things were really hard, he never gave up on that idea of a just world.
Yeah, he kept pushing forward, kept fighting.
And that's a powerful lesson for all of us.
It is.
We might not be leading these big movements.
Right.
But we can still learn from him to be braver, more resilient, and really stick to what we believe in.
Whatever that is for each of us.
Yeah, this whole deep dive into the Chicago campaign has really made me think about how complicated change is.
It is.
And what does success even mean? What lessons can we take from this for the problems we're facing today?
That's the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
The stuff Dr. King was fighting against.
Yeah.
Economic inequality, racism, people abusing their power.
It's all still happening.
It is, and it's just as complex and hard to deal with now as it was then.
Totally.
Mm-hmm.
But like Dr. King learned from Chicago.
Right.
So can we.
Exactly. We can learn from the mistakes and the victories of the people who came before us.
Use that knowledge to make better choices, be more strategic, and really make a difference.
Absolutely. It's like we're all part of this conversation about justice and equality.
A conversation that's been going on for generations.
And the Chicago campaign shows us that it's not a simple conversation.
No.
It's messy. There are no easy answers. It means being honest about how complicated these problems are and being willing to change our approach when we need to.
So it's not about reaching some finish line.
No, it's about the journey.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Right.
Yeah.
No, not at all. In fact, it's more important now than ever.
To learn from history, to be part of that conversation.
And to work towards that better future.
Well, this has been a really eye-opening look at this part of Dr. King's story.
Yeah.
And this fight for justice that's still going on.
Mm-hmm.
I hope it made you think too.
Me too. And remember, history isn't just about what happened in the past.
Right, it helps us understand what's going on now and how to build a better future.
Exactly.
So keep learning, keep asking questions, and keep working for that more just and equal world.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Martin Luther King Jr.'s Chicago campaign. Until next time.
Thanks for listening to Mr. Hutchings History. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next time.